guys, welcome to another episode of Smash JT. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the evolution of role-playing games and what the hell happened to grinding. Smash JT. Okay, so where I gotta start this off is back where role-playing games got started, and I'm talking before video games. Dungeons and Dragons was really my first introduction to what today's role-playing games are considered. And while I was born in 1981, real RPGs didn't come around until Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy for me personally on the NES. So I played a bit of Dungeons and Dragons when I was like 6 and 7 years old with my brothers and some friends. It was a very basic version of it, but still very fun. And when I got my hands on role-playing games like Final Fantasy on the original NES, having the ability to put these kind of characters and gameplay into a video game from what used to just be a dice roll and having a dungeon master was wild for the time. And a lot of things were pretty rough around the edges. I mean, let's be honest, playing Final Fantasy where you swing at an enemy and kill him and then have your next guy swing at that same enemy but he was already dead, so you just waste a move. And the battles would last forever and be super drawn out, and the dungeons would have random battles every 5 or 6 steps, it would seem. It was a little bit repetitive, not gonna lie, but for its time, it was absolutely mind-blowing. As time had progressed and we moved into the 16-bit era of Final Fantasy 2 and 3 and Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and then over on the Sega Genesis with Phantasy Star 2, tons and tons of role-playing games with random battles and lots of grinding. And this is something that I look back on with my nostalgic goggles and say, man, I really miss those times of the random battles and leveling up your characters and fighting through all these enemies to grind up just to be able to prepare for these dungeons and hopefully be successful all the way through into beating the end boss. Truly having that sincere feeling of accomplishment and being so rewarding. These games didn't have save states and for the most part didn't have much ability to save, especially when you got into the dungeons. So a lot of this was based off the grinding you did before you got into the dungeons would determine how successful you were once you were finally going through the dungeon. And if you were to lose and die in the dungeon, you'd go all the way back to your save point originally from the last time that you saved the game, which sometimes could be hours worth of gameplay lost, gone forever. And that's something as time has progressed that seems to have been forgotten by a lot of people. Video games, for the most part, have gotten quite a bit easier. Now people might hear that right away and say, oh, Smash, what about Dark Souls? That game's super hard. Look, Dark Souls is a hard game, but there's plenty of save points, there's plenty of ways to progress through the game successfully if you're talented and skilled enough with it. With these old school role-playing games, it didn't really necessarily matter how talented you were. It was just how much did you grind beforehand, determining a roll of the dice of once you get into the dungeons, if you'd be able to last long enough with your health potions without them running out, and if you'd be able to survive to the end and beat the end boss before you could finally get back to the town, or at least outside of the dungeon to save again. And this all got me thinking about where has the grinding gone, because as far as what I've seen lately with role-playing games, they've become so much more hand-holding, so much more focused on entertaining and fun value that a lot of the times it almost feels like they've forgotten the point of the journey. They're too focused on the destination. There are so many games out there looking to steal your attention away from the games that you're playing currently that the game that you're playing currently has to do a good job of hooking you, engaging you, and making sure that it doesn't let go. It's kind of funny because I look back at when I was a kid growing up playing these games like Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger. I remember vividly having thoughts in my mind saying, I can't wait to show these games to my kids someday, how much they're gonna love them. And now that I actually have kids and they're 5 years old and looking at the games that they're playing, they really don't have the patience to play Secret of Mana or Chrono Trigger. I'm not really sure if that will change as time goes on and they're able to read and get more into the games, but the way the direction the game industry is headed, the focus is placed on entertainment and fun instead of drawing the storyline out and making sure you enjoy the journey. And it's almost training people nowadays to not expect a journey in their games, but more so just to expect a storyline and how do I get through the storyline to get to the end of it. Again, not a bad thing, just a completely different way to look at video games, and certainly not a direction I expected the industry to go in. Role-playing games, for better or worse, have morphed more into action-adventure games instead of just a pure adventure. And I feel like that has more to do with people's attention spans and the quality of games that are out there and time people have to play than anything else. Like, honestly, as far as the role-playing games back in the day, the grind existed because the technology was lacking to make anything better. And while I do in theory miss the grinds, that's just in theory, because when I put it into action, I really don't want to sit down and play Phantasy Star 2 and go through those grinds again. My nostalgic goggles tell me it was a lot of fun, but when I actually pop it in to play it without using save states and modern conveniences, the game is just not as fun as I thought it was. It was just really fun for the time because better games didn't exist back then. And that right there is the harsh reality for a lot of these old school role-playing games. They're a ton of fun to play, but they don't hold up to the modern conveniences that exist in today's world. It's almost like saying, I really enjoyed TV when it was black and white, but then they got these color TVs and those are a little bit better, but the original black and white TVs actually showed the pictures moving with sound too, so why can't we just watch those? No, things get better, technology advances, and for the most part, it leaves what used to be fun in the dust. So that in turn makes me wonder about what will be the thing that draws people into the next generation of role-playing games to make them look at this current generation and say, oh my god, I can't believe we used to spend our time playing those, because that's exactly how I'm currently feeling about the old school RPGs like Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star 2. That's not to say they're bad games. What it really comes down to is summing it up from the balance perspective. How games back in the day seemed to heavily rely on the aspect of walking back and forth, getting into these turn-based battles, just so you could go up levels and become strong enough to be able to beat the end bosses at dungeons and progress through the game. Whereas nowadays, they've removed that whole aspect of it. You don't see people really going back and forth to battle enemies anymore. They go straight through the dungeons, fighting the enemies with a lot more strategy involved, as opposed to having a stronger party that can just blow through all the enemies. The balance in these games has changed completely over the past couple of decades, where nowadays games like Bravely Default, Ni no Kuni, and other RPGs, not necessarily JRPGs, I count God of War and even Horizon Zero Dawn, I count those as RPGs. You go around fighting enemies and going up levels per se. You're able to increase your armor, get stronger by fighting more guys. But the balance is a little bit more present there, where you're not going around just fighting guys all the time just to go up levels. You're able to progress simply by playing through the game in a natural order. Although I did reach a point in Horizon Zero Dawn where I would have either needed to grind or just lower the difficulty level a little bit because the enemies were just getting way too hard for me. And the game was okay with that because they knew most people just played the game to get through the storyline, because the storyline in that game, as well as most others these days, is the main attraction. Having the freedom to select how you want to go through a game is everything, and it's something that's offered nowadays that was never available on these old school games. Though there is something to be said for a high difficulty level where you just have to go through the game the way it's set up for you, just like anyone else does, but there's no shortcuts, there's no way to lower the difficulty, you have to play it the way it was made. It's interesting how what we find fun in a game has morphed into something completely different over the years as technology has progressed. Back in the day with a game like Phantasy Star 2, the main attraction for getting through it was figuring out your way through these mazes, sometimes getting out a pad and paper and drawing it on there, trying to find out what the right directions were, learning as you go, not making it through the entire dungeon, trying all over again from the start without saving any of your XP that you gained, starting all over after you die in the dungeon, and learning from what you had and going again from there. That was fun back in the day. Trying to do that now would just drive somebody insane. People want progression. People want to know that what they're putting their time into a game is actually going somewhere. They don't want to, quote unquote, waste time with a game where they just play it, die, and have to start over from scratch and play it again and hopefully not die the second time. That could make a game last literally forever. And I'm okay for the most part with the direction that the industry is headed. But that doesn't mean a part of me doesn't really miss these old games in the way they used to play. Games like Chrono Trigger had a really good balance and were far ahead of their time based off of other RPGs that came out around then, forcing a heavy reliance on working the XP up and making sure your characters could actually win battles against enemies just because you're pressing left and right on a controller to fight enemies over and over again just to build up your level to be strong enough and continue the game. So is grinding dead? A part of me feels like it kinda is. Outside of those indie games that will continue doing that forever, the major AAA publishers and the big RPGs that are coming out now are focused on the balance aspect and the entertainment aspect of the game, making sure you enjoy what you're playing instead of making you go through the motions, going back and forth and fighting the same enemies over and over again. Like I said, not necessarily a bad thing, but it does in a way explain why these great games like Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and Phantasy Star 2 will never show up again. Because technology has advanced to the point where we don't need to waste time anymore. We can focus on what matters, the storyline, and enjoying the actual game, progressing through it. The problem with that is, some people forget the reason to play these games in the first place is to actually enjoy them, to live in the worlds, to be a part of them. And I'm guilty of that as well sometimes. I feel like I'm rushing through games just to get to the end of them and not really truly enjoying everything they have to offer. Partially because there are just so many games out there and I want to play all of them and I have a finite amount of time to do so. And that's something that didn't exist back in the day. Games are everywhere now in plentiful supply with online downloads and super cheap sales. It's completely different than the way it used to be, where people would get maybe 5 or 6 Super Nintendo games a year, max, and they'd have to get full enjoyment out of those with their game time. Nowadays, it's not really the same, and it's not a bad thing, it's just a different thing. And I never thought I'd get to the point in my life where I thought my kids would like the games I used to play, but because there are so many other games coming out now, taking their attention away from them, I wonder if they're ever going to find the time to even go back and play those games that I originally grew up and loved. As time progresses, I worry that people are going to start forgetting about these old school games just because of the sheer amount of quality and quantity of games that are coming out every single month of every single year right now. It's a completely different landscape than it used to be. Anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you feel about the RPG situation right now? Do you miss the random battles and hardcore grinding? Or are you happy with the way it's progressed to the point it is right now with a lot more balance? And also on top of that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the future of RPGs, where you see it going from here. How could a game get better than God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, or Zelda Breath of the Wild, Dragon Quest XI? So many incredible experiences. Have we reached a pinnacle point of video games? Or do you feel like this is just the beginning? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one. I need to step outside myself and look at this situation and say, God damn, I sound like an old man shaking his cane and all the kids running out the street saying, you guys need to learn how to play these old RPGs. That's not necessarily what I'm trying to imply with this video, just more saying how the industry's evolved and how I didn't really expect it to go into this direction, and I don't really feel like there's a way for us to ever get back to the way it was. And part of the reason I have such a passion and nostalgia for these old school RPGs is because they're so exclusive, they're so unique. There's nothing that's going to come out now that's going to trump Chrono Trigger the way Chrono Trigger did Chrono Trigger. And that's where the nostalgia lies.